Thank you. First, I just want to say, Lin Lam, that was amazing, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation. In many ways, I think half of what I'm going to say is like repetition of everything that has just been presented. But there are a few places I'm interested in pushing and maybe opening the conversation, bridging it to the particular people we have here today with us. I'm René Clair. I'm a professor of history and media studies here at NSSR and at Lang. I work on things like cybernetics and cognitive science and neuroscience, kind of histories of computing and digital media, and so I have a particular relationship to speculation and change, and the future already being here or past or whatever. And then our other presenters today are Patricia Klauf. She's the professor of sociology and women's studies at the Graduate Center of Queens College of the City University of New York. She does an amazing oeuvre of work and is currently doing work on measurement, I believe, and thinking about how measure and affect impact ideas of change, and I'm looking forward to that. We also have here Mitch Horowitz, who is the editor-in-chief of Tartar Penguin and an author of Occult America, The Secret History of How Mysticism Shaped Our Nation. He also gives tours, apparently, of the occult in New York. You can find out more about that from him. Tomorrow, in fact. You can just keep going with with finding out your future. And finally, we have Dara Kin, who's an independent scholar. He's a historian of science with an emphasis on the history of medieval, Renaissance, and early modern astrology. And I don't know if you're still reading people's charts, but he can do that too. In case you need a more conclusive, you know, again, we need to prognosticate. I'm just going to briefly, I'm not really talking, I just want to throw up, we were asked to bring objects, and that in itself already brought up a certain question for me about like what would an object constitute in the world I live in. So I want us to open with this thing that, you know, this theme is on speculating on change, and I'm not always sure what the relationship between speculation and change is, and I think that already came up, but I would like to kind of bring that up throughout the discussion. And I guess I want to open with three images that might ask us about both speculation and about change, and whether the two are necessarily related. They might also ask about what our relationship is affectively to how we see in the objects that seem to embody or hold change within them. So I'm going to open with the mathematical theory of communication, a set of neural nets, a foreign policy decision-making tree from a book called The Nerves of Government, Critical to Policy Making in the 60s, based on game theory and cybernetics, and the Black-Scholes option pricing formula. And I want you to just kind of leave all those things in your head, just kind of encode them and be like, what did I just see? So all these four images encode prediction, probability, prognostication, sometimes even ghosts and spirits in our minds, machines, governments, and markets. So these little, and let's just look at neural nets because they're always lovely. Oh, sorry, this is not my computer. What just happened? So these little wily circuits and these have all sorts of strange temporal features. And for me, I'm really interested in how these little circuits travel from inside our brains to governments to pricing equations. And all the things I've shown you are closely related to ideas of communication and information. And in fact are all based simultaneously on concepts of cybernetics or game theories or operations research, all kind of fields that are linked together. And you can ask me more about them, but I just want you to contemplate these things together. And these things all have kind of strange temporal features. So mathematical communication equations that are encoded, in fact, in all our machines and phones and other things, predict what a system can do. They predict what types of messages will be able to be sent, but they don't really ask what the specific content of the message or where it came from. Neural nets, for example, have also kind of a strange, wacky temporal structure. They can predict the future actions of their brain, but you can never, or you can anticipate them, but you can never really tell where the signal came from in the past. So neural nets are kind of temporally amnesic. which makes all of us kind of a little bit psychotic, but rationally, because that's how our brains work. And then, you know, when we go through game theories and models, create and direct organizations, and these little equations, of course, drive literal speculation and circulation in the market. And we've discussed all of these things in the course of your presentation. And all these things speak to the literal future tense of the world of a tomorrow that theoretically is already here today or even yesterday, or so we think that we're always speculating. We assume we live in a society of risk. I'm not always so sure, and I think we assume we know too much about what we don't know. But these little equations and diagrams also pose some questions for me that I want to pose to us and to the speakers about technology and prediction, and about prediction and change, and about automation and imagination, and whether we can actually automate chance, and what are the stakes that are attendant to that, about whether change always means emergence or sometimes it means repetition. These kind of images that I'm showing you are also the very infrastructures of our contemporary world. They're encoded in machines and people and organizations. They're embedded inside systems at levels that work in a sort of networked unconscious. These are not things that kind of come top down, but they're kind of already inside. Every day you're already predicting. When I read the write-up about this presentation and show, one of the questions that Lin Lam put forth was Appadurai's idea about whether or not speculation can be learned and transmitted. Well, every morning when you open your computer, I think it definitively answers that question. Yes, it can. But one of the questions is, under what conditions would that become a radical politics? And can it be? So I think that I'm really obsessed with this automation of chance and of speculation. But I also brought these particular little examples that all seem kind of cold and yucky and rather mathematical, although I adore them all. I do too. I brought them together because they all relate to whether speculation is related to the specular, to the ability to see or represent either the past or the future. And I'm particularly highlighting this because we are here in a center of art and politics. And so one of the questions is how to identify and think about aesthetic practice in relation to the political, and what's the relationship there to the specular and to speculation as a kind of specular activity. I don't know if there's always a relationship between the ability to speculate and to see. I think we love to measure things and make data visualizations and infographics and charts and maps and videos and movies and any number of documentary practices that will somehow reveal to us in the kind of divination way of an astrology chart the logics of some broader massive system, or again, the future. But I'm not sure how we reconcile those practices with the logics of systems that I'm not sure work on that perceptual mode at all. I'm not sure you can ever really visualize your system, and I'm kind of curious about the urge to do so and what work that does and how that changes in particular historical moments. So I want us to also talk about art and politics, then about the aesthetics of speculation, of what work aesthetics do in allowing us to continue to act, and the politics of aesthetics and the politics of specular speculation. I noticed in the course of the video, you know, this need to find an object to allow people to show how their field understood changed, and so people stuck up their graphs, or they brought out their Wall Street journals or whatnot. And so I'm really curious about that, and as artists I'm really curious about what you want to do by invoking that and objectifying it, and what kind of object do you understand that, and how do you understand that as phenomenally. So in relation, and I'm trying to think about this politics of aesthetics in relation to the infrastructure and technologies that make speculation autonomous and automatic. And I also want to know, in lieu of the other guests here, about how spirits and ghosts and other things still haunt our little speculative machines, our quite nervous networks, and our nervous selves. So I'll end with that question around the autonomy of speculation from people, and and I'll leave it to you. So thank you.
Am I next? Ouija?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, as a prelude, and forces beyond the self.
Absolutely. Well, talk about charts and models. My name is Mitch Horowitz, and I write a lot about the history and impact of alternative spirituality, particularly what's called the esoteric or the occult. Everybody recognizes this, don't they? The Ouija board? How many people here have played around with the Ouija board when they were kids or presently? Yeah. It's kind of spooky, isn't it?
I was scared.
Yeah. I am going to have a little PowerPoint display on the history of the Ouija board because it's quite fascinating, and it really captures the images of some of the most unusual spiritual experiments in America. I wanted to show you an antique Ouija board because it's quite beautiful and it's just so recognizable. Everybody knows these images. This is from 1967, which was the first year that Parker Brothers started manufacturing the Ouija board. Until that time, it was the property of a Baltimore family named the Folds. They sold it to Parker Brothers in '66. The next year, it outsold Monopoly. It was absolutely incredible. And I love showing this to people. Of course, you'll have to come up to me later if you want to get a better look. This is a very valuable board, but I sort of bring it around with me like it's a cell phone. I should probably be more careful with it. This is called the Planchette, or the little plank that you used to go around the board. I was showing some of the other panelists before that the pointer is actually an iron nail. You could never do that today. There would be all kinds of lawsuits and everything, but this was a simpler age. Ouija made such an impact on this country in the 60s and 70s. It was part of a whole occult revival. Everybody seemed to play with one. It seemed to be in every basement, every playroom. But it's not as popular today as it used to be. And Hasbro, which owns Parker Brothers, shrunk it down, and they put it in a kind of glow-in-the-dark little variant. It's maybe about 70% of the size that it used to be. And to me, this is like the new Coke of occultism. I'm very disappointed with it. I like to hold on to the past, and but when a classic product starts to slip in sales, they tend to redesign it. So that's what Hasbro has done with the Ouija board. And there's no more metal pointer in the Planchette, I'm sorry to say. I had a tough time getting the people at Hasbro to even talk to me about the Ouija board. They continue to sell the product, but they're very skittish about it because I think, frankly, they're very worried that, you know, someone's going to do some horrible thing and say the Ouija board made me do it, and then there'll be a boycott from the Christian right. And, you know, they seem to want to continue selling it, but they really don't want to talk about it. I had to actually write a personal letter to the president of the company before somebody from marketing would call me back, which she eventually did, but it gave me a sense these people really don't like to talk about this product. I'm going to give a quick PowerPoint demonstration that goes through the history of Ouija because it's quite beautiful and strange. And let's see. Where does Ouija come from? In colonial America, up through the generation following the War of Independence, there was a philosophy that traveled here from Europe called Mesmerism. Today we sometimes call it hypnotism, but it involved putting people into these trances where they were in some kind of a suggestive state. Some people came out of the trances and said they had been cured of illnesses thanks to the talents of the mesmerist. This philosophy was, the creator of this philosophy was a Viennese healer named Franz Anton Mesmer, who said all of life consisted of some kind of invisible fluid, which he called animal magnetism. People got fascinated with this and with what it said about the mysteries of the mind. This led in part to the movement called Spiritualism, which swept through this country starting in the late 1840s. It involved Americans forming themselves into seance circles, as you see here, getting involved with spirit raps, various forms of communicating with the dead. This movement in earnest, in the form that we recognize it today, really began in America, in upstate New York. This was America's first religious export, in a sense. As soon as Americans started organizing themselves into spirit circles and seance circles, a couple of years later, people started doing it in London and Paris, and then it just exploded. But Americans had a kind of different perspective on the matter. They really loved do-it-yourself methods in all areas of life, including contacting the spirit world. So this little device called a planchette became very popular. It was used for automatic writing. You would insert a pencil in the top, go into some kind of a trance, maybe a mesmeric trance, or maybe some sort of a spiritually suggestive state. Today we call it channeling. And you would just guide this thing over a piece of paper and presumably contact beings from the beyond. And this got very popular. By the 1860s, ball-bearing planchettes were being advertised here in America. You could buy them by mail. Everybody was talking about it within certain circles. And it didn't stop there. Again, this do-it-yourself impulse kept going. People kept asking, is there an easier and more automated method by which we can contact the beyond? So these dial wheels started to become popular. They were invented by an engineer and spiritualist who lived in Connecticut in the 1860s. And sometimes it's actually hard looking at these drafts of these things to figure out precisely how the communication occurred. They came in many, many different forms. This is a popular one from the 1880s, you know, just this alphabet wheel that people would use. It was a lot like the planchette. You just didn't need to go through the inconvenience of using a pencil and a piece of paper. You know, you could use it over and over. And again, keep looking for that do-it-yourself impulse. That's what people were after. They wanted to contact the afterworld with no intermediaries whatsoever. It's a very American impulse. These things, this is still surviving. It's magnificent and strange. These things came in all different shapes. And you see this was one where you just move back and forth. And you could tell this is moving in a certain direction. And the direction that this is moving would eventually, by the mid-1880s, become recognized to us. This is the first drawing and the spitting image of the thing that we today call Ouija, but it wasn't called Ouija back then. This is a little tiny drawing that appeared in 1886 in the New York Herald Tribune. It was an article about a craze sweeping through spiritualist circles in northern Ohio. People called this the talking board, and they would balance it on their knees. In fact, the newspaper in the same article had an image of a man and woman balancing on their knees together. It's kind of a flirtatious encounter. And you see they have that little table that they're moving around the board. I don't know if the artist captured that quite accurately, but that's what the planchette was supposed to look like. You see at the bottom it says the talking board. Now this is really interesting because, in fact, the Ouija board wasn't patented until 1891. And after it was marketed as a commercial product, there were years of patent litigation where people within the Fold family of Baltimore were fighting with one another, fighting with people who said they had a claim on the invention and so forth. You know, my contention is that I'm not sure that Ouija was ever a viable patent to begin with, because these images are from a full 4 years before the first patent was even filed. This was a homemade device being used among Ohio spiritualists before this family in Baltimore managed to file and win a patent on it in early 1891. But there you go. I mean, you see, you know, if I go back, there's the homemade device, there's the patent. It wasn't really an invention. You know, they were capitalizing on what was a folk object. It was a homegrown method among spiritualists that some of these folks in Baltimore managed to get a patent on. And after that, it's just history. And yet, there were, that's actually that's an early image of the Ouija board. That's a prototype image. There's William Fuld, who managed to get the first patent. It made him $1 million, but it cost him, I presume, a peace of mind, because he never spoke to his brother, Isaac, again, who made a competing board called the Oriole board. That's the classic Ouija board. That's the board that we know today. And you see it says across the top, William Fuld talking board set. So Fuld sort of took credit for having created the Ouija board, but again, he really was one of the people who came on the scene shortly after the patent, and he managed to find a way of marketing it brilliantly. But it wasn't an invention. It was a folk object that they managed to sell as a product. That's the box. It used to be called the Egyptian luck board. You know, there were all these different claims attached to it. That's another part of the box. You see that image of the young man and woman? It looks a lot like an image from 10 years earlier that had appeared in the the New York Herald. There was always a flirtatious aspect to Ouija, where it was an opportunity for a man. Usually it's always a man and a woman that are shown in the images using the Ouija board. You can see this on this box as well from 1967. This is sort of like, I guess you can't see it, it's a little Scooby-Doo image of a man and woman sitting there facing one another with the board balanced on their knees. But it had a very flirtatious quality in an age where men and women couldn't sit together without having a reason. This was a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. This was from May of 1920. This was Norman Rockwell's send-up of the Ouija board. And it goes to show how popular it was, because everyone who looks at this picture recognizes the Ouija board. They recognize what's going on. You can see the couple's knees are touching. Again, you know, this image just became perennial. William Fuld attained his greatest commercial success, but he actually died shortly after this. He was supervising the installation of a flag post on his factory in Baltimore, and he fell three stories backwards and died just as he was experiencing his greatest commercial success. This was the Oriole board. This was a knockoff that William Fuld's brother Isaac produced. Isaac was found to be in violation of the copyright, but this was the kind of thing that tore the family apart. They never spoke again after Isaac completed this illegal board, and yet again, they're just copying something that spiritualists were using back in the 1880s. This is Ouija Girl. This is a knockoff board from the 1940s. I'm going to show you some of the knockoffs because they're very beautiful, and the federal courts just couldn't keep up with it. There were so many people imitating the board. The Magic Marvel board, that's a very beautiful one from the 1950s. The Raja board, that's also from the 1950s. The Yogi board, you know. I mean, they were all related to the same basic template, but people brought their own imagination. And this was the big turning point. This was 1967 when Parker Brothers first started to market the board, and it just exploded. This was where it became an object that you found in every basement, every playroom. This is a very beautiful board from 1971. This happens to be my favorite. I think it's just so freaky and beautiful, and you would see how these things would change with the times. Again, all around the same basic template. Another very beautiful board from the early 1970s. There was this whole occult revival. The New Age movement was starting to get underway. You know, it goes perfectly with the musical Hair. You know, just these wonderful convergences. And this, of course, so passes glory. This is the Witchboard movies from the 1990s. These were some pretty horrible splatter films that used the Ouija board as a central symbol. There was supposed to be another Ouija board movie coming out. It was under production in the year 2008, but it never got underway. And everybody wonders, you know, why has the Ouija board disappeared? Why is it less popular? Why is it not as widespread today as it was certainly when I was growing up, when you would just find one in almost every household? And you know, I'm not sure that it really has disappeared. These things tend to go underground. I think one movie, one song, one story that uses Ouija as its central premise, and it will just come roaring back into the culture. The New York Times during the Second World War had an article that said, in fact, Ouija comes roaring back. Ouija boards were being sold out of department stores because during a time of war, people felt they could use the Ouija board to get in touch with loved ones or determine the fate of loved ones. And maybe because of cell phones and internet connections and so on, you know, those impulses are directed in other places. But I think Ouija is going to come back. It's just going to take one mention, one Jay-Z video, something, and it'll be back with us. So that is a brief history of the Ouija board. Thank you all very much.
This is so strange, as it should be, but I am known not to be able to sleep almost always, but so I don't know if it was last night or the night before at maybe 2 in the morning, and I had no idea that you were going to speak about that, on House, you know, the doctor, what do you call those, drama repeats? A bunch of boys playing with a Ouija board, absolutely. And it was predicted that one of the boys would die. And so he, of course, then got very ill, but was saved by House. Isn't that amazing? And they had the Planchette.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, because they were in an attic. They had found a very old version. It's great. So I have a few, I have no object except to speak about them, I think. My performance is that straight read of an academic paper, which we should have, very short though. I'm a sociologist, and so maybe that shows here, and as Orit said, I'm probably repeating or channeling a lot of things that I think are on your website, and even some of the ones you mentioned. But then we know each other, so that makes sense, right? So, although I'm not quite sure what Edward Tufte's point was in authoring his book, I am enthralled nonetheless with its title, Beautiful Evidence. Surely I can repeat what any reader could about the book, Beautiful Evidence. That is, that it produces a number of presentational styles used to evidence the world, its being and its becoming. From 216 fishes, shown each in an unchanged frame, that therefore requires that each fish is made to fit by a different and unknown scale of measurement, to the uncovering of a mapping for Paul Cézanne's painting, Two Pictures and Fruit, to the summing up the fundamental principles of analytical design, shown especially in Charles Joseph Minard's data map, describing the successive losses in men of the French army during the French invasion of Russia, as much by Russian aggression as by snowfall. Such principles as show comparisons, contrasts, and differences, show causality, mechanism, explanation, systemic structure, ensure multivariate analysis, completely integrate words, numbers, images, and diagrams. So while Tufte's aims are simple enough to repeat, what the point of the book is, given its ending in an overflowing of disdain for PowerPoint, is not so clear to me. At least it may well not be the point that the title first suggested to me. That is, that we are at a threshold, if crossed, would change our thoughts about beauty or aesthetics and evidentiary discourses. If for Tufte the PowerPoint is not evidentiary, but rather loose argumentation that is mind-numbing, it is because he backs down from this threshold rather than crossing it, backs down into the distinction, if not opposition, of concept and intuition, content and form, mind and matter. But what if Beautiful Evidence suggests that evidencing rather than represent worlds makes worlds, what we therefore might have to call future worlds? And does it not follow that there is a rethinking to be encouraged about the beautiful, about methods of measure, engaging, that is, the problematic of methods of measure, to bring us back to aesthetics in the being and becoming of worlds? I want to propose that recent philosophical discussion around aesthetics, and there is much of it going on, may be pointing to profound changes in measure, to what Lin Lam's project also seems to point. This change can be grasped as an assemblaging of two disjunctive series in the domain of measure in the context of what Christine Harold has called aesthetic capitalism. One series refers to biopolitical governance, and the other to market speculation in the circulation of affective processes. And here, by affect, I refer generally to incipiences or potentialities to affect and be affected, or to the augmentation or diminution of a body's, and not necessarily a human body's, capacity to act, to engage, to connect, such that autoaffection is linked to the self-feeling of being alive, that is, aliveness or vitality. Thinking of affect, then, I want to turn to what is being called aesthetic capitalism, to point to a recent shift in the functioning of brand, from its being about the auratics of the circulating sign, to its making objects things that themselves exude and transmit affect or potentiality. For example, the way commodities are or are made to invite a certain futurity, to invite a certain participation with them in becoming lively or feeling alive. In enabling objects to offer future behaviors to us as our own, there must be a manipulation of memory or the past, or what Luciana Parisi and Stephen Goodman have called a mnemonic control of a preemptive or speculative logic. For Parisi and Goodman, the operation of preemption through branding seeks to remodel long-term memory through an occupation of or the parasiting on the dynamics of short-term intuition, where past, present, and future coexist as affect. That is, as a potentiality or intensity, which repeatedly instigates activation in the neurophysiological plasticity of the body-brain. Branding's occupation of short-term intuition is something like a distribution of memory implants, which provides one with the bodily or affective sense of an experience one has not had or a memory one has not had, while nonetheless giving a base for future activation or repetition of affect. It is a potentiation or an activation of affect that, however, means to foreclose actualization, turning potentiality back on itself, producing a surplus of affect or audience effect. The economic power of preemptive logic also points to a kind of governance that might be described as biopolitical, or better, beyond biopolitical governance, because to preempt memory in relation to affect is to not merely govern life and death as in biopolitics, but to return to life's non-lived or not yet lived condition of emergence or potentiality. It is to bring life back to a non-lived incipience or potential, to redirect emergent effects. Brian Masumi calls this power beyond biopower ontopower, and Tiziana Terranova, following Maurizio Lazzarata, describes it as the ontological powers of time memory. We might remember that for Foucault, biopolitics focuses less on the disciplining of the subject and no longer takes the family as the model of good governance. Instead, the family is taken as an instrument in the biopolitical governing of populations to mediate the statistical measuring of populations' capacities for life and death, while the Oedipal complex or incest taboo gives way to the resetting of the limits of perversion and a redesigning of the scene of the social, recognizing the way in which classificatory and regulative mechanisms increasingly are elaborated for every recognizable state of being, such that normal no longer is the opposite and necessary complement of abnormal, deviant, or dysfunctional. As such, governance is free to treat family violence, if not violence in general, as one criteria of the differential capacity of populations for life and death, a technicalization or socio-normalization of violence in the setting to risk the life and death capacities of populations, or practicing what I have been calling of late population racism. And we also might remember that Foucault, in his lectures on biopolitical governance and neoliberalism, pointed to ontopower beyond biopolitics, proposing, as he did, that in neoliberalism, life and death are governed by optimizing nature, where nature is not matter in opposition to social construction, but rather it is a matter of the incipience and potentiality of a natural process artificially optimized into a political economy. As Foucault put it, where the problem is how to modulate what he describes as the circulation and I quote, a series of mobile elements, an indefinite series of accumulating units, an open series that can only be controlled by an estimate of probabilities. These are the object of a neoliberal political economy, Foucault argued, where a formal organization of inequalities and equality of inequalities aims to produce market competition rather than exchange, such that life and death become more abstract, bringing into thought what he called non-organic life, which is beyond both the homeostatic equilibrium-seeking life of the organism and the Oedipal narrative as well. Thus, the power beyond biopower, the ontopower of an ontology of time memory, is at a threshold that points beyond the modulation of the probabilities or improbabilities of life and death capacities or body partialities to the beyond of non-organic life, its dynamics and measure. Thus, to point to a beyond biopolitical governance is to see how the measure of governance efficacy is in the modulation of populations' life and death capacities has become a speculation in effective processes. That is, aesthetic. That is, where the organism or narrative may not be able to order or hold the legitimacy of governance, and where therefore there may have to be a measure that enthralls and generates enthrallment with measure. A measure, therefore, where the units of measure change with what is measured, change with every measure relative to the generativity of measuring itself, or where measure is in constant variation because it must modulate the rhythm of the rise and fall of affect. A modulation of ontopower and the generativity of measuring itself. To close, let me return then to philosophy and the recent development of what is called a speculative realism in a philosophical turn to the sensual as the vicar of the real. That is, where it is proposed that real objects are in relationship to real objects, but only through the sensual profile that each real object bears. In its recent turn to the sensual as vicar of the real, philosophy, perhaps not so surprisingly, refines aesthetics, and following Alfred North Whitehead's radical revision of Kantian aesthetics, proposes that the being or becoming of the real object is in its allure to feeling. That's Whitehead's term. And here, objects are not only alluring us as their way of being, but they are alluring each other as well, such that allure is essential to all experience. Indeed, Whitehead, Stephen Shaviro tells us, meant to take aesthetics from philosophy's margins, making the aesthetic proposition central to philosophy, recognizing the rise of affect as the basis of all experience. The aesthetic proposition is not about truth or falsehood, but the beautiful. Delight, but repulsion too. The aesthetic proposition carries a force of non-deterministic change, in that it is an intense assemblage of objects, one indifferent and the other disinterested. One object lures indifferently or without care for which object it might be that is lured. Yet an object having been lured finds the alluring object beautiful. Not an object of interest, use, or cognition, the lured object is an object of disinterested passion, a wild passion. The intensity of affect, disinterested and indifferent, is a vector of potentiality, what Whitehead described as paving the way along which the world advances into novelty. Going back to Kant, Shaviro tells us that aesthetic passion, since not about need, is only possible beyond the fulfillment of need. If need presses on, however, it becomes enwrapped in the rise of affect, blocking it and making it avariciously repetitive. As such, the allure of the beautiful freezes the lured object in a reductive response to the luring object's superfluous self-exhibition. So this recent turn in philosophy, this return to aesthetic, seems both to make possible a critical engagement with, but also mimics the circulation and affective processes, providing a link between a speculative economy and the shifts in governance, re-scening the social, and delimiting perversions in the deployment of a preempted futurity. It takes us to the shift in measure, to political economic efficacy as a matter of aesthetics, as a matter of sensation and effective tone across all strata of existence. Thank you.
And now for something completely different. Unlike the other. This is a horoscope for the event, actually for the beginning of the panel discussion at 3 o'clock, so we're a little bit past since I'm the third discussant here. But this is one of the two tools, and they're both related, that I'll discuss today. My name is Darryl Rutkin. I'm a historian of astrology, but as Reed said, I'm also a practicing astrologer. And in fact, it was practicing astrology that got me interested in the history of astrology. I got interested in it when I was 18 or 19, going through some sort of, crisis of, growing up, trying to understand why I was different than other people. And I found out, in fact, looking in an astrology book, that Mercury was retrograde in my horoscope, which made perfect sense, whereas none of the other stuff I read made any sense at all. And it was in Sagittarius, too, which is a sort of wideness of vision that made perfect sense to me. At any rate, so it seemed to me, after about 10 years of paying attention to my horoscope and doing others, that astrology works. But in our worldview, it shouldn't work. So I thought, well, what did smart people in the past, retrograde Mercury, think about how astrology worked? And I found this fascinating story, which has been, I won't say completely, but virtually completely forgotten through some process that I like to call interparadigmatic refraction, where we just don't see it. It's really extraordinary where we distort it. But in fact, when I started to pay attention, and my central question is, how did astrology come to be removed from the realm of legitimate knowledge during the scientific revolution? Because what I found was that astrology was taught in the finest universities in Europe from roughly 1400 to 1700, including people like Regiomontanus, Galileo, Kepler. When you start looking at the evidence, you can't avoid it any longer. So you ask the question, well, how did it come to be removed? But in order to answer that question, you have to first understand how it was configured within the patterns of pre-modern Aristotelian Ptolemaic knowledge before then. So that's volume 1 of my monograph that I'm currently finishing. But that relates to questions of change. And in fact, when I prepared this, I was thinking more in terms of prediction, but I'm glad that, change is central, because one of my favorite texts, it's called the Speculum Astronomy, written in the 1260s. It came to be attributed to Albertus Magnus, but in fact, we don't know who wrote it. It begins by saying that you can understand the motions, the mutatio, the changes, well, the changes in the heavens are the keys to understanding changes on Earth. And in fact, when I look more deeply, this is central to Aristotelian natural philosophy, because change cannot exist in the world unless there are planets moving. And that's what links the kind of the realm of the divine with the realm of the earth, which is all change all the time. As Aristotle said, physis, nature is the arche, the beginning of change. So change is central to the system of nature. Okay, he also thought that you could understand God's providential ordering and creation of the world through astrology as the link between metaphysics, the divine realm, and nature. Okay. So the horoscope is the basic tool of the astrologer. What is it? Oh, it's actually the link where art, science, and politics intersect. So the scientific part is the mapping of the planets in their given signs in the zodiac, and then coordinating that to the time and place of an individual's birth and a nativity, or for an event, as here. And if you can visualize this, each place, of course, has a horizon line, which is the AC line, there, the ascendant. And then there's the meridian, which goes, you know, where noon would be when the sun passes. And those become the fixed grid for every place on Earth. So once you fix that, then the circle of the zodiac turns within that during the course of the day. The ascendant is the degree of the zodiac coming over the horizon at the time of birth or at the time of the event in relation to the place of the event. So the sun is in Virgo now. Happy birthday, or around here somewhere. So at dawn today, since the sun is in Virgo, then Virgo is rising at dawn, and then at noon, you know, it moves actually 2 hours or so per sign. And you can visualize it moving around. So at 3 o'clock today, the very, very, very end of Sagittarius was on the horizon, and now we're well into Capricorn, for whatever that's worth. So the scientific part is where the planets are, mapping them based on planetary theory and observation, and we figured out these problems. We understand how the planets work, and we can map them, and we can make predictions based on them. I'll talk about that more in a second. But once you get this, then there's a transformation from the scientific to the art of interpretation, because the planets, although objects in the heaven, become symbolized in some way that has a very rich tradition that reaches deeply into antiquity and has, I'm sure, something to do with the depths of the human psyche. I'm sure Jung would talk about it in terms of human beings looking into the heavens and projecting their psyches there and then telling stories about what they see. And, you know, they think they're looking objectively, but in fact, looking at reflections of their own mind. So this symbolism, of course, has a rich tradition going back to Babylonian antiquity and Greco-Roman antiquity, and is interlinked with the gods, so there's a strongly religious dimension as well. So art, science, and then politics. There is a rich nexus or expression, practical application of astrology in the political realm, Ronald Reagan being a famous recent example, and I'll talk about another earlier historical example in just a moment. So that's the basic tool. Great. So this is what an ephemeris looks like. A page from an ephemeris, actually a page for this month. So it lists every day of the month, and then all the planets. It's hard to read, but sun, moon, Mercury, all the way through, and then it tells you where they are in the zodiac. So it gives you that basic information. And in fact, this is the astrologer's basic tool. A job I had about 20 years ago in San Diego, of course, was working for a 900 number. So I would sit there with 50 other people doing different sorts of practices. And somebody would call up, and they were paying $3.99 a minute. I didn't get that much money, but you know, so I didn't want to take time. So I'd, you know, find what they were, either their birthday or if they were looking for some event, and just go through the planets and, you know, give them interpretations based on that. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so this is the way astrology works now, but my main interests are the historical dimension in my research. So let's go back to 1659 and look at a text by a guy named William Lilly, who wrote a text called Christian Astrology at the very end of the interregnum before Charles II was reinstated as king. And you can see in the top there that he uses an ephemeris for this basic information. So one of the things I'm trying to understand are continuities and changes. One of my big questions is how astrology came to be delegitimized as knowledge during the scientific revolution. And in fact, what it is today is kind of an alternative discourse of knowledge operating. A lot of people who are very serious and very smart are taking it seriously in various different ways, but of course it's no longer taught in universities. It's no longer legitimate knowledge, except historically, you know, as a subject of history, at least to some extent. Anyway, so one great example of how astrology ramifies in politics is this guy, William Lilly. During the Civil War, 10 years before, in the 1640s, there were astrologers on both sides of the political conflict between the parliamentarians and the royalists. Both sides had their astrologers, and both sides were publishing almanacs every year explaining, you know, predicting the future and predicting how they would be victorious and their enemies would be defeated. And in a way, it's the last great flowering of astrology in politics. Here you can see an ephemeris from Christian astrology, a page from an ephemeris, and you can see it's exactly the same information, slightly more difficult to read, but virtually exactly the same information there. One major difference, though, I showed you the contemporary horoscope before, which was round. In fact, until fairly recently, most horoscopes were square. Nevertheless, it still represents exactly the same information. I'd like to say one thing about prediction, and then I'm going to show some pretty pictures. Predictions vis-a-vis legitimate knowledge. Often astrology is considered a type of divination. People today say that. One of the things I've found most challenging in trying to understand astrology historically in a sound way is that often we take our contemporary conceptual configurations and then read them into the past as if there were, you know, as if it's, you know, what's the right way to say it? Yeah, as if you didn't need to historicize the past material. It's obvious to us that it's this way, therefore it must be that way. In fact, the use of configuring astrology as a quote-unquote occult science is one of those things that makes me completely crazy, because people normally assume that there's some internal relationship between all of the so-called occult sciences and then read that into the past. Not everybody, of course, but it's one of my bugbears. At any rate, Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus's star pupil, talked about different types of predicting the future. And he talked about three kinds in particular, trying to distinguish the legitimate kinds from the illegitimate kinds. The legitimate kinds he both called astronomia, which, although it's the same term, refers to two distinct practices. The astronomical dimension of astrology, which is, as in an ephemeris page, where you can predict where the planets are going to be in a year, just the astronomical dimension of that. He said that was certain knowledge and was absolutely legitimate. The other type of prediction, and this relates to Ptolemy as well, but I'll just talk about it through Thomas Aquinas, is the astrological kind of interpretation where you look at a horoscope and you make predictions about the weather, about the grains, about rulers in various cities. But that is not an exact kind of interpretation. That's a conjectural or probabilistic kind of interpretation. But for Thomas, that too was absolutely legitimate. So he then contrasted those two types of predictive knowledge about the future with what he called divination. And for him, every kind of divination was completely illegitimate because it had truck with demons. That's the only way it could be known. Astronomy and astrology, or what we distinguish as them, can be known through their causes, whereas what can be known through divination can only be known in themselves or through divine revelation. So if somebody's saying it, then they are either, a prophet, which some of them claim, or they're in truck with demons and should be thrown behind bars. Okay. Now it's a slideshow of the typographer of Christian astrology seems to have taken acid in the middle of printing the thing, because this is a normal horoscope. But now you're going to see a display of variations that are actually quite marvelous, and God knows why. I've never seen any discussion of this before. But he gives this display of like 15 different kinds of ways to make horoscopes that are really quite magnificent, I think. And they all have the same information, but somebody was having fun. Thank you very much.
We all have to go. Yes, now there's a discussion. I'm supposed to be moderating. Well, thank you all. I guess the best way to do, well, I have many questions, and I think I fronted some of them at my introduction, where I was interested in speculation and automation and the imagination. I would open it now to the floor if people have questions about anything that people have said up here, and also maybe relating it to Lin Lam's piece that you saw before, or any questions you have about the piece. So, do people have any questions?
Yes, kind of for Daryl. In the art world right now, there's sort of two currents. One are sort of the Druids like myself who are interested in the work of the scholarship and the work of people like Richard Tarnas and Carl Jung, and ideas about synchronicity and that relate to higher physics, that sort of thing, and versus sort of the theoretical types whose probably biggest book on astrology would be Theodor Adorno's When the Stars Fall Down to Earth, which is a really blistering attack on the Los Angeles astrology column, linking it to the dark forces of sort of bourgeois ignorance and fascism, and trying to completely delegitimize it, which is rather sad. And I wonder if you feel that this is part of this trend to sort of put astrology into a kind of a category where it's sort of put into junk science or whatever.
You mean the latter part,
yeah,
not the
latter,
stuff
yeah.
that Rick Tarnas, et cetera, are
Yeah,
doing.
because, I mean, Tarnas is wonderful.
He is wonderful, absolutely. And he's not a historian. What I'm trying to do is really just try and bring an understanding of what astrology was in the past accurately into the present psyche, and then see what happens. I'm not trying to re-legitimize it as knowledge in the present, even though I personally feel that there is some sort of legitimacy to that knowledge. My kind of professional preoccupation is to simply be able to see its past history in its centrality as clearly as possible. I'll let people who are more theoretically oriented try and understand, you know, the broader meta questions about that. Does that
Kind of. I guess what I'm saying is within sort of the art world where there's so much theory, astrology really cannot be accessed very easily, except through sort of talking about it through, political factors or capital or something like that. And sort of these more occult forces simply have no place in the discourse anymore.
Yeah. Really? I'd like to add a comment to that. I think your observation is very right, and something that I've noticed that sometimes can stymie our discussion of things that are associated with the occult or with alternative religious or spiritual practices is that the fee of entry to the mainstream is disavowal, that you have to start from that point before you can actually join the discussion. There was a movie made maybe about 9 months ago called Men Who Stare at Goats, about psychical research in the Army. And it was a lot of fun, and I saw it and I enjoyed it, and I read the book and I enjoyed the book too. But the book was welcomed into the mainstream because the author of the book, who was a documentarian, took, well, I would say it's not unfair to say he took ridicule as his jumping off point before looking at this phenomenon within the military. At no point was the question ever innocently and respectfully asked, could any of this be true? Or if not true, at least anomalous enough to say there's an alive question there. So I think, it has something to do with modernity and the way that certain trends and how we think about underlying factors and things and how religion is regarded have entered things that tend to validate institutions that tend to validate discussions, whether it's the pages of the New Yorker or the New York Times Book Review or large museums or galleries. Things have hashed out in such a way that disavowal is the fee of entry before you can even begin to discuss these things. And I think that impoverishes our discussion.
Another?
But maybe just as a slight complication to that, because one of the things that I think is interesting in the Lin and Lam project is this multidisciplinarity. So maybe just to throw out a slight complication to that is to say that if we're speaking specifically about astrology, perhaps that is true. But if you think of something like Marina Abramovich, her most recent show at MoMA, where she sat for the duration of the show under a performance titled "The Artist is Present," and there became almost a kind of mystical pilgrimage to sit with her. Then we could also ask what's happening in that desire to sit, what's happening in her, in the set of intentions that go into building that project, which in some ways is acceptable within the discourse, but also is something that exceeds the discourse and is very actually dominant and at this present moment inside of, in the art world.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I'm sorry if my piece was a little thick, but I actually don't think, I think it's very interesting that, in fact, it might not be the case that what I'm finding is, although philosophical and, maybe what you're calling theoretical, that there's a huge opening about questions of what is objectivity, what is aesthetics, how do we measure, in the science, across the board, in science and physics, that actually, it may still be the case that you'll have to do the disavowal, as you were pointing out about this, but there's something happening inside those domains that we usually think are the legitimate ones that cannot hold their legitimacy. They're coming apart. And the Adorno reference is great because, in some sense, the way Adorno configured something outside of the sciences or reason and capitalism and bourgeois. I mean, we have some problems before us about capitalism and governance, that's for sure. But that kind of configuration isn't going to really work much longer either as a critical configuration, because too many of those boundaries are being overrun in many domains, not just art, but actually in any field that can use and will have to use soon beautiful evidence, which we're kind of forced to be doing.
Yeah, well, actually, could we take one from the back?
Actually, I just want to add one thing in terms of beautiful evidence. part of our research, and maybe that is different for me, is Vitruvius' 10 Books of Architecture that we found in his writing back in when that book is published. I don't even really know, but the version I have is about 1920 something. Anyway, he recommended, he cited that in the past there were evidence of before you actually build a building, you should actually go through the process of killing an animal or two. And if there is evidence of disease or of what am I thinking? Well, anyway, if the animal appears sick, then that site itself is perhaps not the right site. So, in terms of visuality or let's just say aesthetics and political subjectivity and social subjectivity, I think for me, if I can speak in terms of for our work, there's a moment that we also have to suspend a certain kind of disbelief first, or certain belief or disbelief, to investigate and to ask questions, so that we can see, to borrow the sense of seeing, to speculate and seeing whether in the future or in the past, and what we can speak to from the present.
Just a question back there.
I just wanted to respond a little bit. It's actually a related point. A lot of the points that you guys are making about aesthetics and sort of policy decisions and those kinds of larger questions. I'm coming to this from the background of city planning and urban planning, and to me, it's almost funny, like you guys talking about it in these terms, because to me, a lot of these models are very quotidian and boring, and like they're not at all mystical. And I'm just wondering if you guys have explored at all, like, basically how you build a transportation model. Like, how do you decide how many trains you need at rush hour on the E line? Like those kinds of transportation models, which are not aesthetic, and believe me, not at all enthralling if you actually look at the information. But it is about controlling a narrative, and it is about, how the decisions will be made predictively.
It's enthralling when it's on Google Map or someplace on your iPhone.
No, but the models.
I'm teasing.
I'm talking Excel.
I mean the information.
I mean, I know both of us spent a lot of time actually working with that type of model. Like I did stick up a government kind of projection of an organizational flow chart. I did stick up a organizational flow chart based on notions that we should be modeling communication. I mean, one of the things you do in urban planning is also try to figure out what to measure it, how to show it so that you can act. And I think I'm very interested in that as an aesthetic practice, that we can't separate that the minute you said that, no, it's not aesthetic, I'm like, no, it actually really is. It works on the sense, and people are going to show their two different projections, and one planner is going to win and one's not, right? Or whatever. And politics is going to get debated and many times and decided at that level. And I'm interested in whether there's historical transformation in that mode, that's becoming more intensified in certain ways, and that we need to be rethinking the political into these micro practices of infrastructure, visualization. That's a critical thing.
Aesthetics there doesn't mean pretty. It means these practices and postures of doing things.
Yeah, I understand that. I think that to me, the conceptual meat there, though, more is about the built-in paradox in planning, where you have to, you must predict what's going to happen, right, and yet you're always going to be wrong. And that, to me, is like the interesting thing about planning, which is, at least, I mean, you could make an aesthetic argument about it, but I think a lot of it has to do with, like, what was the value of $1 10 years ago, and what's the value of $1 going to be in 20 years, which is something you have to constantly work with, even though you really don't know.
I just want to say, to underline what Ari just said, that if you take someone like me who's and I'm not, but I'm supposedly a social scientist, I love that you raised the question of things, you know, we talk about Ouija and as being something, but also for social scientists, urban planning is something, but it's not a social science, right? I mean, which is, I don't even know what that kind of thing means, but it means something. But you're in a field of practice and policy and where you know things are always going to be wrong. We're always saying things that are going to be wrong, but we don't attest to that very easily, like you just did, because of that science kind of thing around it. So I think those boundaries are like opening up in a big way. I think that's what you were you implying that? I hope you were planning.
Yeah, if you, by the way, if you take the business about cutting open an animal now with the environment, I think they're all sick, so we're going to have a lot of unfortunate circumstances as we cut them up. But in terms of, I think, Pat's paper, which I think was rather intriguing in terms of all the things we're talking about, I have the impression what you were talking about was how does one, in fact, have knowledge nowadays? And it's, you know, centered on what could be art, and if you look at it the wrong way, then all of a sudden you get whacked in the head and you start going in a different direction. And it seems to me that the old form of art was the astrology chart, and that, that in fact you had people that interpreted it, and once they did, then you had a beautiful art piece that you could then determine what reality was supposed to be about. And the reason that the astrology charts are disappearing and the Ouija board is disappearing is we now have the media. And Fox News is doing our interpretations for us. And so, as a result, we no longer, you know, I mean, unless you get a larger media that you can move in some other way. For a little while, I think Obama, in fact, had the media. And then he lost it at this point. I don't know, you know, why, and so on. So it's like we're now using the media as our astrology chart. And that's, so long as we don't question it, so long as we're not able to move it somewhere, it's the art form that we currently sort of flow into. And then it may be a horrendous place to be, but that's where we are. And I don't know how to get out of the media chart of the present, and I'd like to ask that of the panel.
I think that the way you just described it is exactly Adorno's critique. I mean, I don't know Adorno's critique that well, but I think you basically described what he was critiquing was people's dependence on the media as a kind of medium, as actually transmitting truths, and that kind of what he would say is like a human weakness to depend on some exterior source of divination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we'll take one more question in the back.
Yeah. Hi, I wanted to comment on what this gentleman said about the alternative media doing our interpretations for us. That's true, and it's pretty sad, but there is an alternative media, and that is the internet, which all of us probably in this room are very much involved with. And the discussions, including astrology, the discussions of everything symbolic are all over Facebook, they're all over multiple websites. And while this conversation hasn't been legitimized by the institutions cited by our panel, it is nonetheless still happening. So I think the question is, are we heading toward a time where this alternative conversation that includes symbolism and a little mysticism mixed with science is going to be, well, I think it already is, but where the mainstream says, yes, this exists as well. Last night, there was a conversation with, I can't think of his name, I can't say it exactly, the man that wrote the book with Stephen Hawking, who of course has come out and said that God has nothing to do with creation, in so many words. And Deepak Chopra was part of this conversation. And there seems to be a real battle, you know, heating up again. It's reaching a boiling point between the whole notion of there being something we can't know and we can't define, but something great and something mystical that's at the root of everything. And somehow Fox News and mainstream media, and even the New York Times, has a real problem with saying this exists, because it means that we know a lot less than we think we know. So I just wanted to ask the panel, anyone who wants to address that, do you think we're heading toward a time, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, where what has been accomplished scientifically since 1700 meets up with what existed from 1400 to 1700, and we live happily ever after together?
Well, this may just be a comment on human nature, but something that I have experienced again and again, and I'm sure other people on this panel have experienced this, is that in private, one-on-one, people are incredibly liberal in talking about anomalous and esoteric and even occult belief systems. You know, over a glass of wine, very mainstream people will tell you about something very freaky that happened to them with a Ouija board. When we form, or, you know, astrology, or, you know, something that goes bump in the night, when we form into groups, you know, then when we get around the water cooler, so to speak, on Monday morning, all that goes away. And I've experienced that again and again and again. I've had private conversations with people at some of these validating institutions, and one-on-one, they're fascinating. I mean, they all but ask for a palm reading across the table. But when we go back to our camps and groups, all of that disappears. That just may be a comment on human nature.
Hi, I'm the astrologer psychoanalyst who's in this. I just wanted to make a few comments. This has been very stimulating and flooding for me. But I think we're dealing with a real struggle with the issue between the relationship between consciousness and matter. And astrology and, you know, the early sciences, they posited the fact that consciousness and matter were connected. And that, that what happened around 1700, as I understand it, you know, is that this, when we had the Age of Reason come in, these things were split. So one of the things that started to occur, as I understand it, in current times with the new physics, is we're beginning to reincorporate these kinds of awarenesses that consciousness and matter are connected. And I think this is what we're struggling with. And we're also struggling with the unseen and the unknown. And the unknown scares us because we're out of control, and then we're in danger as a species and we can't survive, or our individual survival is threatened. So we reject this, and we try to impose upon it structures that will make things safe or sure for us. I think it's really interesting what the person behind me said about city planning, where you have to know that you're going to be wrong. Because how is it then that you make your prediction? What do? You have to plan for change, right? What's that? It's boring, but you also have to, like, in some way make a leap. There's a leap, an intuitive leap, that you have to incorporate the fact that whatever model you have, it's going to shift in some way. And inherent in that seems to me to be a sense that you're knowing that there's going to be change of some sort. Now, with astrology and with psychoanalysis, beginnings are extremely important. In the beginning is contained an inferred future. You know, with the astrology chart, it is created from the day, the minute, and the place of your birth. It's a technical construct. You know, it's a scientific technical construct. In that is inferred the evolution of whatever is started at that time. And it has its own developmental cycle that's natural. In the same way when we are born, our bodies have a developmental and psychological cycle. That's predictable. Exactly how that will evolve with circumstances and individual experience is not quite as predictable, but the general form is. At any rate, I am spending a lot of time in my research. I also teach art interpretation. I study a lot the interface between the inner and the outer worlds. And one of my specialties is I teach art diagnosis at Pratt, the New School, and the School of Visual Arts. And I've been correlating people's artwork, interpretation of their artwork psychologically, both with their psychodynamics, but also with their astrology charts.
If I could just ask you to...
Yes, and I will now shut up.
No, that's okay. It sounds great. I apologize. We're just trying to move through the program. If there's one final comment from the speakers to your wonderful set of questions, does anyone have any last words?
One thing I just been kind of come up very brief. The tarot card is a Google, is like a search engine. So I thought that was interesting.
What?
Some people regard the tarot card as a search engine, like Google.
Yeah.
I also do want to just point one thing, and this returns to my political concern, and maybe coming back to the accident of history and 9/11, that I find curious our normative assumption that we don't want things to fail, and that we are so absolutely terrified of the unknowable. And I'm more interested in also when in markets and other things, it's an inbuilt structure, just as in planning, where we assume in speculation that someone's got to win and someone's got to lose. We assume that things are going to not quite go right. We are always waiting for the next attack or whatever. There's an anticipatory logic. Sometimes it becomes extremely reactionary, and sometimes not. So I'm kind of interested in when we accede to failure, when we don't, and whether we've sort of now built, since the 19th century, a whole new set of tools around probability that actually mechanize risk and bank in on it, and we trade it, we sell it, we work with it. It's the substrate. And like I really want to thank both our artists for bringing that unconscious, if you will, out, working us through it, perhaps not in its totality, but at least opening a certain way to begin to re-narrativize, perhaps, or reorganize this kind of phenomena that I don't think we can ever actually fully express or get at. But anyway, so thank you. And thank all of you.